I mentioned the Ronnies a bit ago, and I don't know if you're familiar with what they were.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
So
you would give words, and people would make games
well,
inspired by the words. And
Iron Chef started that.
yeah.
And what Iron Chef did was, I believe, that gave 5 words and you could use any 4.
Mm.
And it had a period in which you presented them, the games, and they were judged kind of against each other somewhat competitively, particularly as Iron Chef proceeded. And they and they had a period. There was even a time when you actually, when the process was quite prolonged, and you actually got to revise it as part of the process. A great deal of those transmogrified into the mechanisms that you'll see at Metatopia, for example. Whereas I decided that I liked the whole thing to be looser, rougher, less competitive, and much more focused. So what I did was, I first of all said that there were 4 terms, and you picked 2. And the only creative constraint from that was that whatever the other 2 terms were, they shouldn't be central to the game. They should be kind of eliminated as major conceptual players. And then also it was to be a 24-hour game. You did it in 24 hours, and whatever you got, you got.
Wow, it's impressive.
And I really liked
316 was originally made in 24 hours. That's intense.
Yeah. So were quite a few of others. In fact, a lot of games might surprise you at their origins in the Ronnies. I was pretty happy. But one thing that I didn't like was how many people rushed to publication with what was basically, a beloved alpha that had been play tested a couple times.
Right.
And quite a few of them would have stood back-burnering it, getting back to it, and saying, hey, wait a minute, I have an epic campaign game here. Or releasing yourself from the constraints a little bit of, people tended to think small. They said, well, if it's a 24-hour game, then it must be a single session of play, which makes no sense, but you can see how they would talk themselves into that.
Right.
So anyway, it was kind of interesting to see what people did with it. But another thing about it, particularly in the second rounds that I did, was to say you're not competing. Every one of them, which I think meets the criteria, will win. So it wasn't like you had to beat the other entries in any way.
Right.
But there were a couple of interesting possible combinations to mess with. One thing, of course, since entry was voluntary, I didn't want people to enter and force themselves to try to do it. I'd give the words, and then people would get going, and they only did it if they looked at the words and were like, ooh, I can do something with that. And then go from there. I didn't want anybody to try to force themselves to do it. And also sort of the enjoyment of seeing what on earth everybody else would do was part of the fun.
Right.
So I'm not sure that as an individual exercise, the Ronnies would be very, very useful.
Right.
But all that said, now I didn't use this combination of terms in a Ronnie in the past. I made it up recently. But if you look at it, you can see that you could have moon and chapel, and there could be no maiden or mirror,
right,
and so forth. So let's see: moon, chapel, moon, maiden, moon, mirror, chapel, maiden, chapel, mirror, and maiden and mirror. And the idea being that the game is not supposed to be restricted to those terms. Whatever other terms you wanted to suddenly, riff into, anything else is fine. But that ultimately, when you got the game and looked at it, the illustration would definitely have those two things in it somehow. And it would, and justifiably so. And so to then say, okay, I've got 24 hours. You can designate when you start. You don't have to start that second. You would say, okay, Tuesday is my day. I'm going to get up and I'll have 24 hours. And I found that for some people, it really was a brain flexing creative exercise. They really said, wow, I just kind of broke out and I could leave behind my epic game that I've worked on for 15 years.
Yeah.
I could leave it behind. I could do anything. And of course, Ron's the judge. Of course, I can do fucking anything. So, cool. And so I don't have to please him at all. He's impossible to please. Nobody can tell what's going on in there anyway. So I'll just do whatever. And so, and his criteria was not that it met these standards, but that it met standards that suited it. So, I found that to be a useful thing. Doing it is work. Running a Ronnie's is brutal.
Yeah.
And I have determined that I will never do it again unless it benefits me more directly than it has.
Right.
Somehow. But I'm thinking of playing with it a little bit as a consulting device. And so should you look at those and wake up in the middle of the night tonight and say, Maiden, Moon, son of a bitch. And if that happens, then run with it. If it doesn't, then don't, is all I'm saying.